one of the more famous scenes that you find in the context of the Nativity story involves the shepherds in the field. And so if you think back to the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, the shepherds are basically doing their thing when all of a sudden this huge group of angels appears to them in the sky. And of course what they say to them is, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace to people of good will." Now that said, perhaps the more interesting passage for our purposes today involves the Holy Family. And so obviously after the angels appear to the shepherds proceed with haste to Bethlehem, where they stumble upon Mary and Joseph and the child Jesus in the manger. And of course they go on to recount all these incredible things they've seen and they've heard. In response to which the gospel says that most people are simply amazed. They experience amazement, they experience wonder. But in contrast, when it comes to the Blessed Virgin Mary, what we hear is that she keeps these things and then ponders them in her heart. Now, if you think about it, this is actually kind of incredible, right? Because, of course, they're talking about her son. And so as a mother, you would expect that she would very naturally be caught up in everything that's being said about her child, who he is and what he'll ultimately become. But again, she doesn't do that, right? She doesn't allow herself to be caught up in the great excitement and euphoria of the people surrounding her, but instead, again, she keeps these things and then ponders them in her heart. Now, just to be clear, what's being highlighted here is not so much a steep contrast between the active life and the contemplative life, or being quiet as opposed to not being quiet. Instead, what's being conveyed is something a little more rich and a little more deep. This notion of recognizing the things in this world which are important, the things of God, and then choosing to respond accordingly. And this actually comes through when you break down this particular story in light of important translation issues and also how it compares with other stories in the gospel. And so, for example, when you look at this word which is rendered here as amazed, again, in the sense that these people were basically amazed at these things that the shepherds were basically saying about the Christ child, what you find when it comes to this word being referenced elsewhere in the gospel is that this actually conveys the common response that people have to supernatural phenomenon. And so the whole idea is that whenever something big or flashy happens in the context of the world, or again, something supernatural or clearly of the Lord, yeah, people are amazed. People are filled with wonder. But the key nuance here is that even though these people might be amazed, even though they might be truly filled with wonder, this doesn't necessarily imply that they have a true faith or a true desire to understand what God is actually trying to convey through this particular set of circumstances. And you find this, for example, when it comes to this really interesting story in the Gospel of Luke chapter 4. And so basically Jesus Christ, in the context of this story, he goes back to his hometown of Nazareth. And initially the people are amazed and filled with wonder in response to the wisdom conveyed through his words. But then all of a sudden he says something they don't expect, or he says something that they don't really want to hear, as a result of which they actually move to kill him. And again, this all happens within the context of the same story, which obviously implies that even though they were entertained and enthralled for a certain period of time, this experience didn't run very deep, in the sense of deepening their relationship with God or their experience of faith in him, as a result of which, again, by the very end of the story, they actually moved to kill the long-awaited Messiah. But you see, hold that thought now and think about the contrasting example of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who again keeps these things and then ponders them in her heart. And so the whole idea is that in the face of this amazing, incredible, supernatural thing which has just happened, the Blessed Virgin is not simply content to move on to the next entertaining or enthralling thing, but instead she recognizes that this is important. And so we're called to pause, we're called to take this thing in. And if you read between the lines, it's pretty clear that Mary doesn't fully understand what's going on here. And in fact, she won't understand for a period of years even. But at the same time, again, she recognizes that this is an important moment. We're called to stay, we're called to pause, we're called to keep and ponder, trusting and believing that if I simply do this, if I stay in this moment in the way that God calls me to stay, eventually in time I will be changed in the way that he wants me to change. You know, funny enough, Pope Benedict XVI talks about this particular phenomenon in a slightly indirect sort of way in speaking about the three kings that you find in the context of the Nativity story. And so basically what he says is that a lot of people living in that region would have seen that really famous star in the sky, that really famous star at Bethlehem, which ultimately leads the three kings to discover the Holy Family and the Christ child. And so there might have been this wow factor, right? A sense of being overwhelmed by the brightness of the star in the sky, but ultimately no change. No change in their level of faith, their understanding of God's will, or even the slightest movement in their heart to incline themselves to go God's way, even just a little bit more. Whereas in contrast, again, you have these three kings, these men of implicitly deep desire, deep conviction, who leave behind their places of comfort, their places of familiarity, their homes, their kingdoms, in search of they know not what. And that's why Pope Benedict says very strikingly that in the context of the gospel, these men aren't simply described as being kings. What the gospel says is that these men are wise. Okay, one final example, I'll kind of end with this. And this involves a funeral that I did recently here at the parish. And so basically, as a matter of background, typically what will happen when I prepare for a funeral is that I'll ask the family to submit a bunch of bullet points about the person who's died. But they'll always give them the option. Like, if you want to come in and talk about the person, obviously I'm happy to do that. But that said, I gotta tell you that whenever these meetings happen, and again, people are trying their best to convey, different points about the person who's just died, I'm certainly taking notes and recording everything that they're saying, but at the same time, I'm listening for, like that special moment, that real special moment in their telling of the story where this is the thing which seems really real, which is of the Lord, which really helps to capture the essence and spirit of the person. And this happened pretty early in our meeting in this particular case. And so basically what happened is that we were going around a circle, and the whole idea was that everyone sitting at the table would contribute in terms of a memory they had of the person who had just died, and we would kind of build a story collectively. And the first person to kick things off was the son-in-law, who began by saying something relatively simple and seemingly ordinary. So basically what he said was that this person who had died, his mother-in-law, really had a habit of putting other people before herself. But then all of a sudden he stopped. And I remember looking at him and wondering why he wasn't continuing, but then all of a sudden he gestured over to the other side of the table, and next to me, his son, the grandson of the person who had died, was suddenly weeping. And then he kind of moved to his mother, and his mother held him and tried to console him. And then everyone started feeling, and everyone started weeping in response to this thing which had just happened. And see, what's interesting is that when this happened, everyone had the intuition, the correct intuition, obviously, to stop and to pause and to keep and to ponder, because, here was something which was unexpected, but unexpectedly beautiful. And so it would be inappropriate to move on, but instead the invitation by the Lord extended to us implicitly was to stop and savor this moment, which was sad, yet beautiful. It just so happens that the family shared with me another beautiful moment involving the person who had just died. And so basically the person in question died on a Wednesday, but then on the Sunday prior, the family was with her at the hospital. And because it was December and everyone knew that death was just around the corner, they were celebrating, in a certain sense, Christmas early. So they were having a turkey dinner and whatnot, and the grandson was feeding his grandmother. And then finally, after a certain period of time, everyone was about to leave, but then the grandson, he kind of stopped at the doorway. And then he turned to his grandmother, and basically what he said to her was, "I love you, Grandma." And again, on the face of it, kind of a simple thing. Who hasn't heard that before? I love you, Grandma. Not unlike, she put other people before herself. But at the same time, they stopped, they paused. Everyone cried because they recognized this was a really important moment to savor, to taste and see, and to keep and ponder. But you see, it speaks to a really important point in the spiritual life, right? Because, of course, the world will always encourage us to go the way of amazement and wonder, to kind of always look for like the next big thing, which is going to entertain us and enthrall us in some way. But the gospel, in a certain sense, is inviting us to do precisely the opposite, to allow ourselves to be fully immersed in the context of the simple and the humble and the ordinary, and more to the point, to allow ourselves to discover the richness of God's glory contained in our ordinary life. And when we discover these moments, to not let these things fall to the ground, but to taste and see and keep and ponder, trusting and believing that if we focus on the few things the Lord wants us to focus on, these things, through our contemplation, through our prayer, will ultimately transform us. It will lead us to see as God sees, to live as He lives, to love as He loves. And may God bless you all.